Hey there, this is Mike with Sundance. So today we're going to be installing this unit. It's going to be an installation video to show you how these things go up. Now this is a demonstration unit that we'll use at home shows, things like that. It's about 10 by 14, not a particularly big system. It's going to be freestanding. We are going to take a couple shortcuts on stuff just to speed up the process of this video, but we'll make sure we explain everything as we go, and there'll be a couple supplemental videos on some of those steps that we're going to skip. Okay, so we're here in Utah in our main location. We've got locations all across the country where you're going to be able to buy this product and get it delivered or shipped from, all that kind of stuff. But this is our Utah location. We're proud of being American made and built right here in America, being manufactured here in America, supporting American jobs, all that good stuff. Okay, so one of the first things that we're going to talk about is setting your posts. So as you see here, we're using this post bracket which fits inside of your post. Now, when you look inside the bracket, ignore that. We're just kind of using these bases that we made up for the purpose of this freestanding unit that's used for home shows. But look at these anchors that we got next to it. These are headlock screws. You can get those from any Lowe's, Home Depot, basically any hardware store. It's a very common one for anchoring into a wood substrate, a deck, or something like that. Okay? The anchors that you use to anchor the post is going to depend on your local codes. It's going to depend on the size of the system, your local building codes, what your requirements are, your wind rating, all that kind of stuff. So the anchors that you're going to use for whatever situation or something that you're going to need to look up what's appropriate for you. I'm showing you here a couple of different anchors that we typically use for installing in concrete. Right? You've got the expansion joints, you've got your typical concrete screws like your Titan HDs or Redheads. You've also got the epoxy systems from Simpson, from Hilti, from a lot of different companies. Okay. Again, same thing, you're going to need to determine with your local building inspectors, with your local engineers, what the appropriate anchoring system is for your application on each job or for your area. Okay. So, one more thing I'm going to show you. We're looking at the post base here, and each post base is going to have 4 screws on each side of it. You can see that here in the video as I pan over. With all of our posts in place, the next thing we're going to do is install the beams. The beams are horizontal supports. You should receive these beams with the bearings pre-installed for the louvers. You can see how that should look in this shot. Alright, now we're going to speed things up. I'm going to stop talking for a minute, let these guys get to work. You're going to see me walking around with a GoPro, getting closer details to be able to show you guys what's going on in different parts of this. As they're putting the last couple screws in, a couple more points to make. So the bearing beam, the beams that are carrying really all the load of the system, those should be pushed all the way into the post like you see here, and they're going to get 4 screws into the face of this post flange. Okay? Now that may change, again, based on your local engineering. Some areas that have extremely high wind loads, such as Florida for your hurricane considerations, things like that, you may need more than 4. Sometimes that's 6. Again, refer to your local engineering, but typically we're going to have 4 in a symmetric pattern like this on each side of that post flat. Okay. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to get the gutter system up. Now one of the steps we're going to skip is sealing the system. Okay, we're going to show that in a different video, the recommendations on how to get this system watertight. Make sure you're not getting water out of the gutters and out of the corners, and how to drain it properly. But we're going to show you how to put the gutter system up. We're going to start off by putting our corner pieces in. These corner pieces make it so that we don't need a super precise cut on the gutters themselves. They give us a little bit of flexibility. They also make it a little bit easier to get the system sealed up. So as we install these things, we're going to make sure that the top part of our gutter corner is going to be lined up with the bottom of the beam. We want the bottom of our gutters to get lined up with the bottom of the beam. Therefore, we need to put this surface where the gutter is going to sit on top of to be flush with the bottom of the beam. We're going to go ahead and we're going to get those gutters installed. We're going to be putting a screw, a hex head screw, inside of the gutter against the beam, every 18 to 24 inches along the way. That's going to help us get everything sealed up. All right, we'll get to work. All right, so we got those gutters up. Again, a couple big things to remember is that you want to keep the bottom of the gutter flush with the bottom of the beam to keep it looking nice. When you're installing the gutters, you're going to slide it in one side like you see here, and then you actually pull out on the front of the gutter corner piece to drop it down and put it back in place. You're going to put these two little screws on top in order to keep everything nice and tight. Okay, next thing we're going to move on to is the installation of the louvers. And we're going to show you some video of how the louvers can be prepped using the hanger bolts that are going to come with it. In order to install those, you're going to need a specialty bit, which we include with it. And in order to do that, we'll show you, you'll want to make sure that those studs are on the side of the system, the side of the louvers where you're going to mount the motor. We'll get to the motor in a little bit, but we're going to be off screen for a second as we get the louvers set up and ready to go. All right, so as they're continuing to get the louvers prepped, so it's going to take a couple more minutes. I want to talk a little bit more about these studs. So as you drive them in, you're going to want this nut attached there, and that's going to help act as a stopper for you. You do need to pay attention and make sure that that nut is staying towards the bottom of the machine screws. Sometimes it can work up the machine screw, and if you get that stud in too deep, it's going to be hard to connect it to the pivot bar later. Just make sure that that's staying near the bottom as you get that driven in. So use a specialty bit, drive it in. All you do is back it out, go backwards on that specialty bit. It should release. If it happens to stick and start backing the stud out, just drive it in again, get it a little bit tighter in there, and pull it back out. One comment on tools: for the most part, we don't recommend using impact drills to put these screws in and stuff. If you get people who are a little too crazy with the impacts, go a little bit too hard, it can end up stripping out these self-tapping screws. So we typically recommended using a standard drill. That way it'll minimize the chance of stripping these screws out. Once the screws stripped out, it's not particularly helpful. It doesn't really give you anything for the strength of the system. So I'm going to go off screen again. We're going to finish prepping these louvers, and we're going to show you how to get them up. So we got a couple guys finishing up the preparations on the louvers. Another thing that's helpful is we have one of our guys putting the spring pins in place ahead of time. In order to do that, there's a couple little set screws in these bearings that you're going to need to loosen up. It's a 2mm Allen key you're going to need. You loosen that up a little bit, you put the pin in, you tighten that Allen key back, that set screw back down with your Allen key, and then you've got one side ready to go. All right, so we've got the preparations made. We've also loosened up the set screws for the bearings on the opposite side. That's going to make life a little bit easier as we get the louvers up. Now, one thing I like to do before I put the louvers up on an installation is I like to make sure that everything else that I can get done is done. Sealing the system, getting the drainage in place, all of that stuff. Because once you have the louvers up, you have a lot less room to work with and it's a lot more difficult. So I like to stop with my crew, typically on an install. We'll go through, we'll make sure everything else is done, drainage, wiring sometimes, all that kind of stuff. Make sure all that stuff is in place or that we know what the plan is. That way, once we have the louvers up, we don't have to go back and try and fight with the louvers and work around them. So the way we're going to put the louvers up is we're going to hand them up over top of one side. Then we're going to slide one side of the louver in the center hole down into the pin. Once that's slid into the pin and you work it all the way down and compress that spring, then you can drop the other side down after you put the pin into the center hole, and that spring will pop it right back out into the bearing, and you tighten it down with your Allen key again. We'll just do that all the way down the line. All right, with all the louvers up, the next step is going to be to connect them all together with the pivot bar. Now the pivot bar you're going to receive, you should have all the bearings for it. What you're going to need is you're going to need for every louver, one washer, one bearing, and one nylon lock nut. We're going to go through, we're going to put the washers on, all the studs ahead of time. Once those are on, then we're going to put the pivot bar on. If the bearings aren't pressed in ahead of time, I recommend you do that before putting it up. You're going to go down the line, put the pivot bar on, and as that goes on, you're going to follow that up with the nylon lock nut. I like to use an electric ratchet, such as the one you see in the video here. And once that's on, I always recommend backing that nylon lock nut off a little bit. If you really crank down on that nylon lock nut up against the pivot bar, it's going to add a lot of friction to the system, and it's going to make it really hard to open and close, and it's going to wear that motor out or bend the bracket ahead of time. So always keep that nylon lock nut a little bit loose. That we use those nylon lock nuts to make sure it doesn't back out on us unexpectedly. We just don't want to have that torqued down too much. Now we've got that done, the pivot bar is installed. You can see what the final product looks like with that pivot bar installed. So you've got the nut, which was pre-installed. Then you've got the washer, which we put on ahead of time. Then you've got the pivot bar with the bearing inside of it. The little flange on the bearing will be facing out. And you've got that nylon lock nut on the outside. One more thing we're going to show you real quick is what it should look like with the overlap on the pivot bar. Because the pivot bar is going to be 8 feet long. So if you have something like this where it's 14-foot section, you're going to have more than one piece of pivot bar, in this case 2. So we're going to show you real quick what that looks like. So we're overlapping one hole on the pivot bar. Each pivot bar is going to have its own bearing, both with the flanges facing out, away from the louvers. And again, you're just going to leave that lock nut with a little bit of wiggle in it, a little bit of looseness in it, so that we don't bind up the system. Okay. Now the last thing we're going to show in this video is the installation of the motor. Okay, once the motor's done, you'll have some wiring to do wherever it's going to go. But we'll save that for a different video because every situation is going to be different. So we're going to show you some different techniques and some different things we do for that. Now, in order to install this motor, we're first going to place our beam mounted bracket on. Before we put the motor in, one of the things I like to do is I'll take the pivot bar mounted bracket and I'll actually loosen up the piston on the motor. What this does is it lets me have a little bit of room to fine adjust. You've got about 5 or 6 turns of threading on the end of the piston. So it gives you a little bit of flexibility to be able to get a little fine adjustment once you get the motor up there if things are a little too tight or a little too loose. So I'll back it off about 1.5 turns, 2 turns like you see here. Okay. With the beam mounted bracket in place, we'll put the motor up. We'll put the pin through the back side of it with the cotter pin. Then we're going to put the pivot bar mounted bracket on. We got to make sure that the louvers are laying flat, that they're fully closed. And we also need to make sure that the piston of the motor is fully retracted. You can use a drill battery or something like that to make sure that that's fully retracted. It's pretty obvious, but if you don't do that, if the motor is extended, let's say 1 inch, when you put it on this way, what's going to happen is when the system goes to close, the motor's going to keep pulling after the system's closed because it's still got that inch of stroke left to pull in. That's going to end up bending your pivot bar, bending and or breaking your bracket. The motor's going to be fine because the motor is the strongest part of this whole assembly as far as the pivot bar, the brackets, and the motor. So the motor's going to be fine, but it is going to bend up your pivot bar, it's going to bend your bracket, and it's just going to cause some headache. So make sure that that piston is fully retracted before you set everything up. One point of this that I forgot to mention that I frequently get asked is where should you mount the motor? And the answer is it doesn't matter too much. My personal preference and that I found most successful as I've done these installs is that I like to mount it at about 1/3 towards the drip edge side of the system. What I mean by that is if I've got a 14-foot system like this, I'm going to mount it so that the motor is pulling roughly 2/3 of the louvers, where the pivot bar is going to be pulling that. The reason for that is if you're pushing most of the louvers with the pivot bar, that's going to lead to potentially some bend and a little bit of wobble in that pivot bar. Whereas if you put it closer to one end where it's pulling more of the louvers instead of pushing them, you're going to minimize that wobble and that deflection in the pivot bar. All right, with the motor installed now, for the purpose of this video, we're going to be done with the installation. Again, there's going to be some wiring to do still. We're going to put that in a separate video to show different considerations what you need to look for, where to put the box, all that kind of stuff. But we've got the system up. We talked about sealing it. The sealing portion is going to be another video as well, giving you some best practices there. And we've got the louvers are capable of being operated by the motor now. So I hope this was informational. I hope this was great. So this video has taken about an hour and 15 minutes to make total. That's about how long it took this up. Again, we skipped some steps. That would take some time. You're sealing the system takes some time. We've got some screws in there that we didn't. We skipped some of the screws, things like that, just for sake of speeding up the video. A crew that's done one or two of these and has things prepped and all the tools ready to go, this should take better part of a day to install. If you've got a good concrete slab or something that you're installing on top of, a good crew can get this installed in one day pretty easily. So, I hope you've enjoyed the videos. Please leave any comments or questions you have. Contact us directly at info@sundanceol.com. You can also leave comments in this YouTube video. We'll reply there as well. Have a great day, and we hope to see you installing these in the future.